Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is Janell Blue. Janell is the president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, and they are our sponsor. And we're going to talk again about some records that people don't necessarily go after, but they're some of the most rewarding records, and that is records of cemeteries and what they may include.
Well, Chuck, you know, the cemeteries we have today are quite sophisticated, and there are usually run by companies, and so that's one thing. But let's back all the way up to when our ancestors were dying and being buried. What sort of cemetery would you be likely to find your ancestor?
They're going to basically fall into two types. If they're living out in the country somewhere, and they're farmers, they're most likely going to be buried in the family cemetery on the family farm. And we do have an example of a couple of family cemeteries that hopefully they'll show us here in a minute. Or the two are from North Carolina. The one, or the larger one, it's the same family, but there are a number of family cemeteries for this family. The one, there are not too many of the more recent generations still living, so it's not as well maintained. The other one, there are people who are still living, and so the cemetery is well maintained. So it just depends on who's around, but usually the family farm, or if they lived in a town, then the church usually had a burial ground or burial yard around it. If they lived in a large city, then it generally was, or is definitely going to be, the cemetery of the church where people would be buried.
Chuck, the example that you showed, were those cemeteries where the original family still owned the land, or had they moved or sold the land?
I don't know for sure with those two in particular. I am related by marriage to another line of that family, and one of the cousins now owns the family farm, or at least a portion of the family farm, and so the rights to the cemetery she has, and she maintains the cemetery. Usually what happens with that is there is usually a provision in the deed when the family sells off the family farm, and that provision maintains the family's rights to the cemetery, and they usually an easement or an access of some sort is included in that deed, and it usually is worded so that it is passed down from generation to generation. There doesn't need to be a new document created each time.
Even if there's not something in the deed, don't the landowners have sort of an obligation to allow you to access the land? You have to respect their...
Depending on what the state law may govern. I've heard of a few cases where people wouldn't allow families access to their cemetery, and it ends up in court. So, but then as time grew, communities grew, a lot of larger cities run out of land for the church to have a cemetery. So then you see the development of possibly a church cemetery outside the city limits, or today as we have them, we have commercial cemeteries. They're usually out in what was once the country, even though cities now have grown up around them. You may also find that the town itself or the city had a cemetery. Usually there's a residency requirement before you can buy lots in that. And then we also have things like the military cemeteries. We have the Federal federal government-owned cemeteries, Arlington in our area, and also Quantico down off of 95. Also, states may have cemeteries that are military cemeteries, and a lot of counties, at least that I'm aware of in New Jersey and Delaware and Pennsylvania, the counties have a veteran cemetery for residents of the county, and they have to have served in the military. They don't have to have been a career military person, but they have to have had military service. And a lot of these other cemeteries are private cemeteries that have grown up. And then, like I say, the church cemeteries still exist. I have grandparents buried in one church cemetery, and my other grandparents are buried in a public cemetery that goes back actually to the Revolutionary War.
Wow.
So, and they're still burying people there.
And they were marked? There were markers in that public cemetery?
In the public cemetery, yes. Tombstones and now flat ones. And one of the things that you may have, and we have a picture of this, the next slide there. In public cemeteries, there may be a section set aside called the Potter's Field.
Yes.
And this is where either the poor who could not afford a cemetery lot were buried, or somebody who died and nobody knew them. Somebody happened to be in the community, died, and they couldn't find out who they were. And unfortunately, this particular picture shows a lot of these markers sticking up are not markers that identify who the person is. It's just a number on there. And then whoever's in charge of running that cemetery has the corresponding list of who is buried in that lot by number, if they know who it is.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, those cemeteries sometimes end up being built over. Things like that happen with them.
So how are the cemeteries governed then?
Well, usually there are state regulations, and as to what cemeteries can and can't do. For example, the state of New Jersey and the state of Virginia, I know in particular, have very strict regulations on the establishment of cemeteries, what can happen if the cemetery itself goes out of business, and what can happen to the cemetery. Now, if somebody doesn't follow the regulations, then the cemetery may disappear. But they do have, not too far from where we're actually taping, is a shopping center that happens to have a wrought iron fence around it. I don't know whether you've ever noticed in the Pan Am Shopping Center down the road on Nutley Street, there's a wrought iron fence around, I believe it's 3 markers. That is a cemetery that was, I believe, a family cemetery. They have tried to move those graves. They can't comply with the state regulations, which is tracing down and finding surviving family members and getting permission to move those graves. So they can't do that. The fence is there to preserve that. So that happens here in Virginia. There are a number of other places like that. Happens in New Jersey, but then they don't always follow the regulations. And I have a second great-grandfather who was buried in the city of Newark's Potter's Field section of the city cemetery. There was both a section for residents to be buried in and the poor cemetery. He's buried there, and in the 1950s they sold off that land the cemetery was on, and now he is buried either under a building or a parking lot.
Oh my.
Because they didn't get any permission. They just built on top of it, paved it, across from the Newark airport in New Jersey.
And no family member has
no family
tried to
members.
sue them or
Well,
anything?
by the time anybody probably knew about it, it was probably too late, because I just found out about it within like the last 2 years.
We have a very famous cemetery that's near where I grew up, and it's actually a collateral part of my family, and the farm sold it to Kmart.
Okay.
And they paved over, it's in the middle of the Kmart parking lot. And they paved over the cemetery too.
Yeah.
So there's no maintenance required. But there it is, right on a busy street.
Then the cemetery is governed usually by a board, whether it's a church cemetery or a private cemetery. And they set the rules and regulations of, when you can put artificial flowers on the cemetery, what it costs to open a grave, what it costs to buy lots in the cemetery, and those kinds of things. Again, they have freedom there to make those kinds of rules, but they have to follow the state rules for other things. So,
well, what about the old cemeteries where there is no governance?
That's when they often fall into disrepair.
Yes,
and things happen to them. The state sometimes steps in, depending on the state, and takes over control of it. Another cemetery may buy out the cemetery or buy up the land and maintain it. There's a variety of things that can happen.
I know that some historic cemeteries are eligible for governance under the Historic of Federal, National Register of Historic Places, and they qualify it because of how old they are, or what distinction there is, and that of course gives some protection. It helps if there's somebody famous. Sorry.
How do we find it?
So Find a Grave has a lot of cemetery information. That's what that website is all about. But let's just say that your ancestor is not in Find a Grave.
How do you find them? Well, one of the things that I tell people is to look at what the family may have in papers. Somebody may have the deed to the cemetery. Somebody may have, or you can go to libraries and look up obituaries and death notices in newspapers. They always, or normally always, say where the person is going to be buried. And then you can go look for the cemetery. If you don't know, if you can't find anything, then looking for information in city directories, telephone directories, what cemeteries existed at the time your ancestors were living there, old maps, particularly the topographic maps put out by the U.S. Geological Survey. They normally included churches and cemeteries and some other things, but cemeteries, so that's a way of finding them. Or just other old maps of the area may include what cemeteries were there. And looking or contacting the public library, the land records office, because although the cemetery itself doesn't have to record deeds to the lots, the purchase of the cemetery would be in the land records, just like if you bought a piece of land or bought a house with a piece of land, that would be there. And then historical societies, genealogical societies also gather information on cemeteries and places like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of online information, isn't there? And you can go in, you can Google it and find a lot of sometimes
things.
You can even find a listing of everyone who is supposedly buried there. Sometimes the names are not exactly right.
Well, and with those kinds of lists too, I tell people, you want to look for all the lists that were done because they're not always complete. There's a cemetery that my starting with my third great-grandparents on down that line, there's a lot of family buried in that cemetery. I've found 9 different individuals or organizations that transcribe the markers in that cemetery.
Wow.
And I've compiled the list together into my own master list because there's things on one list that aren't on the other, yet the markers are still there or were there the last time I was down there. So, that's another way of finding the cemeteries and where they are.
If you do locate the cemetery and you find out who to connect with, what sort of records are you going to find?
Again, it depends on the practices of the cemetery. They're basically required to at least keep a record of who is buried in the cemetery, where they're buried, where the grave is, things like that. But depending on the practice of the cemetery, they're going to at least keep basic records of who's buried in every grave. They often have maps that they'll put that on. They may have index cards. The cemetery where my father's parents is buried and where my parents are buried and where I'll eventually go, they keep a record of the lot. They keep a record of the family surname. They keep a record of interments by the date that they happen. So they have a number of different records. The one thing I also tell people there, look at all the records that they have, because I've done a comparison of those records. There's information on every one of those cards that's not on the other 4 cards that they keep. So, depending on what the card is, the purpose of the card, what they record on there. And so you don't always have the same information. Now, some of it may be in a, like a register type of book. And we have an example. One of the things that they'll keep is also copies of the deed. And we have an example of the deed that we'd like to take a look at. That's going to give you basic information. And of course, this is provided to the family also. It's going to have a deed number on it. It's going to say where the lot is, who it's sold to, where they're living, and it's usually signed by the secretary and the president of the governing body of the cemetery. And that's more or less standard information that you're going to find in all of them. And then usually on the back of the document gives you a list of the rules and regulations, whether you can plant plants on the grave or when you can use artificial flowers, things like that. The next example we have is kind of a card that gives you a little map layout and numbered the graves, and then lists the numbers with the person who is buried in each of those graves. And looking at these kinds of things, sometimes you find additional information that you may not know about. It's possible that somebody was once buried in the lot and the family moved the body to another cemetery, and that would be recorded in there. And then the next example that we have, if they can flip that up for us, this is an individual record. It's the basic information. This is for a great aunt in a cemetery up in Philadelphia. It gives the basic information of where she is buried and all in the cemetery. But where the arrow is, this included her birth date. And it's not a part of, or not one of the blanks on the form. And it was great for me because I didn't know when she was born. I was just beginning to explore this great aunt and uncle. And so that gave me the information there.
Would you likely have something like that if they were buried in a historic church cemetery?
Usually, yes. A church is going to keep some kind of records. Again, it depends on the practice of the church. may be a register, it may be a card, it may be multiple types of records. And I think we have one more example there that we can take a look at. This is one of the things that's quite helpful in larger cemeteries. They often will have a map of the cemetery, and they will usually provide these for free. When you go into the office and you ask them, can you tell me where the person's buried?
Yeah.
They will pull out a copy of the map and tell you about where. And in some cemeteries, my great-grandparents and grandmother are buried in a large cemetery in Philadelphia. They have the map of the whole cemetery, and then they have a map of each section with the graves all marked on it, so they can X marks the spot, and
That's
you can
great.
figure out
Yeah.
how to take and find the grave. Other things that you might find in the records of the cemetery depend on the cemetery itself, but one record that some states require is a transportation permit to move a body from either one state to another, or even within the state. So if that's required by the state, you're generally going to find a copy of that in the records that they have. You also may find a copy of something called a burial permit, different from a death certificate. Both of these has basically the same kind of information on it, but it's also giving permission to move the body or to bury the body.
And this would vary from state to
Vary
state.
from state to state what they're going to require you to keep.
It sounds like you've had some success in getting records and information from cemeteries.
Yes, I've had a great deal of success
Experience,
and experience.
So are there other places where you might find cemetery records?
Yes, historical societies, genealogical societies, college and university libraries often have copies of things. Also, every once in a while, the cemetery that my grandparents and my parents are buried in, when I go down there and I ask for their records, they tell you the only thing we have in records is a card that tells who's buried in the lot and whether there's a marker on the grave. And I didn't believe them. I didn't believe them for years. And lo and behold, I happened to be in the Historical Society, and I found in a miscellaneous drawer of microfilm 9 rolls of microfilm of that cemetery's records done in the 1970s. And they were done by the Family History Library out in Salt Lake.
Nice.
So they have them. That caused me to go pursue their catalog. I didn't find any other records for cemeteries my family is buried in, but they had them for other cemeteries. So that's a place to look at what they may actually have.
Well, in Houston, in the Houston area where I grew up, somebody did a complete survey of all of the historic cemeteries, and including one that my great-grandmother is buried at. It's called the Blue Light Cemetery.
Okay.
And it's very famous, and kids would go there sometimes because it seemed really spooky. And it turned out that the Germans used this substance in the headstones, and it's called labradorite, and it causes a reflection at night, and so it causes these blue lights, and so it's very spooky. But we don't know for sure who really controls that cemetery now, and that's the sad part about it, especially in an area like Houston where there's floods, and some of those old historic cemeteries are gone, and yet we think we know where they are.
Checking with the county or the city, probably city bans, it's Houston, they probably know who has the records and if there is still in existence a governing board. Also, sometimes the funeral homes in the area can help you with information. And in fact, old cemeteries that, small cemeteries that may have closed down years ago, the records may have ended up in a funeral home. And so funeral homes in the area might be able to help you.
So Chuck, is it important, in your genealogy research, is it important to actually try to go to that cemetery? I mean, can't you just look at it on Find a Grave?
I believe that it is important to go there. Number one, it's the closest you're ever going to get to these relatives, even though, you don't get to meet them face to face. But, looking at the tombstone, looking at who else is buried in the cemetery. You may find some names, particularly if it's definitely fenced in as a family plot. You may find people that you didn't know were ancestors buried there. I've got a cousin who's buried with her uncle's wife's family. When I go look at that family plot, there are 4 surnames there. I'd never know these people were buried or were related there. They're all buried together in the family plot. Also, things like flags or flowers on the grave. Take a note, stick it in a plastic bag, leave it. Somebody's doing that. They may be able to or willing to contact you, and they may be family you didn't know existed.
I through DNA, I discovered this relative, and she introduced me to a cemetery where my great grandparents are buried, and they had sold the property, and it's sort of in the middle of Houston, and so there are houses on all sides of this cemetery, but that area had been designated as a cemetery, so they couldn't build there. We literally had to go through someone's home to get into and access that. Yeah. That thing is not documented in any of the Googles or any other places.
Out of town. So there is a great deal that we can find in cemetery records, and particularly going there. Out of time.
Sorry.
That's okay. No.